Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an international calamity. Ever since autocrat Vladimir Putin started a war to overthrow Ukraine's sovereignty and democracy a few weeks ago, Russia has become a pariah on the world stage and is seen as such for good reason. Whether we are discussing Putin's flimsy justification of fighting Ukrainian Nazis, which is a conspiracy theory rooted in anti-Semitism, Russia's war machine damaging key infrastructure, the deaths of innocent civilians, and the very fact that Russia is in conflict with the very nature of democracy itself, Russia has garnered the world's ire. They have been cast as the unequivocal villain of this conflict, and as such, the Western world has retaliated, though not with violent conflict. After all, America and many other allied countries don't want to engage in another world war if they don't have to, especially considering that such a conflict would involve opposing countries with nuclear arsenals, and no one wants that shit. So instead, the West has been targeting Russia indirectly, to be more specific, in their wallet, mostly in the form of economic sanctions. In fact, many countries have banned the import of Russian oil and gas, the assets of Russian banks have been frozen, the assets of individual Russian oligarchs have also been frozen, and more is being done to cause Russia to be on the precipice of a major recession and an economic devastation that the country hasn't seen since the fall of the Soviet Union. Hell, even the value of the ruble has plummeted. Though I'm not exactly celebrating this because sanctions and damaging foreign economies hurt innocent bystanders the most, all in hopes of influencing political change at the top of the pecking order, which honestly has its own ethical complications due to how the pain is maximized on the working class and common people. But that's a different topic for a different video entirely. The point of this video, though, is to highlight the economic response to Russia after the country has thrown the concept of peace in Europe into chaos, and to be more specific and in line to the topics of this channel, we are talking about how video game companies are responding to the war in Ukraine and Russia's aggression. See, the war's economic penalties aren't just coming from Western nations themselves, but from corporations. In fact, a wide variety of Western companies like McDonald, Starbucks, Apple, and Shell are either pulling out of Russia or at least suspending business operations in the country. And video game developers and publishers are getting in on this action as well. In regards to Russia as a country, and in some cases Russia's ally in Belarus, there have been consequences to Russia's abhorrent actions from a multitude of video game developers and publishers. For a few examples, Microsoft has suspended all new sales of its products and services in Russia. CD Projekt Red also halted sales of its games on Good Old Games, an online storefront that CD Projekt Red owns. Take-Two Interactive has stopped the sale of its games and even their installation in Russia and Belarus, which is a significant move seeing as Take-Two Interactive's Grand Theft Auto 5 is the third most popular game in Russia. Fortnite developer and online storefront owner Epic Games will no longer be offering in-app purchases of its products in Russia. Nintendo is no longer taking any eShop payments from Russian Switch users. Sony suddenly didn't launch its popular racing title Gran Turismo 7 in the country, and Ubisoft, Electronic Arts, Sony, Nintendo, and Activision Blizzard have all additionally suspended sales in Russia as well. It is a lot, and admittedly there are more actions that companies have taken against Russia that I didn't list, but by now you get the point. Russia did something awful, and video game companies, even ones that try their best to avoid taking political stances, Ubisoft, are taking a principled stand. But with that said, what are the stakes here? Why does it matter that a lot of video game power players are pulling out of Russia? Will it affect the bottom lines of these companies? Because of course, with companies, the main moral is money after all. And finally, what does this mean for the future in terms of global economies? And to start, let's discuss the ramifications of this corporate exodus for the Russian people. On a fundamental level, companies pulling out or ceasing business operations in Russia will have a devastating effect on Russia's economy. After all, jobs will be and have been disappearing, and Western companies are no longer putting extensive wealth into Russia's economy. The money is no longer there. It has disappeared like Houdini or content on Netflix. It is over. However, this mass corporate exodus has had an additional effect, mostly in the form of psychological warfare. See, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union and Western companies' subsequent globalization efforts, the Russian people, especially younger generations, have gotten used to connecting with the world through popular Western products, brands, and technology. But Russia's war with Ukraine has thrown that into disarray. The country is now isolated from the world, and in terms of how iconic brands are leaving, this is having a profound impact because it is overall affecting their standard of living. Russian citizens can no longer buy a new iPhone or buy a bottle of Coca-Cola. They can no longer buy items at IKEA. They will lose and are losing a certain connection to the wider world. And while older Russian generations remember a time time before the Soviet Union and rely on pro-Russian news broadcasted on state-sponsored TV, meaning that they might believe they can make do without Western companies and make their own brands, younger Russians who grew up around a post-Soviet Union Russia and gained their news from more independent sources see it differently. After all, they have never known a life without all these brands that connected them to the wider world. And seeing as the youngins are less inclined to believe state-run TV, many of them will ultimately blame Russia and Putin. According to Matthew Schmidt, an associate professor of national security at the University of New Haven, to quote, "To younger Russians, the departure of McDonald's, as well as other companies, will reinforce the feeling that Russia has become an international pariah and is likely to generate a certain amount of shame," end quote. This extends to video games as well, seeing as many game companies are no longer selling their games online in Russia and are even stopping the shipment of new products because Russia's actions are so beyond the pale that they make the cesspool that is normally the video game industry look virtuous by comparison. Russia's video game audience will feel alienated from the wider world. After all, gaming is a popular pastime for Russia. There are roughly 80 million Russians who play games, and with these corporate moves, these Russian players will feel disconnected from the broader gaming landscape, a community that is normally very active online and actively discusses the next big game. Russia will be left alone. Admittedly, Russia has a workaround for its citizens. Earlier this month, the Kremlin legalized piracy of video games, films, and other media in order to counteract the sanctions against the country, as well as the fact that so many companies pulled out of the country. IT companies can now use IP without paying copyright holders any money, and many Russian torrent sites will be unblocked, meaning that items like new Hollywood films and hit video games can be pirated legally. Yet, even with that caveat, Western companies haven't budged. After all, Russian piracy rates were reportedly already high even before the war started, and Western companies that care about their image don't want to cross a court of public opinion that has declared Russia as persona non grata. The West is sticking to principle here. Leaving Russia comes at a price for these video game companies, though. The Russian gaming market was worth $3.4 billion in 2021. $1.4 billion of this money was made through mobile games, with PC titles following close behind at $1.2 billion. Following in third, console games earned about $864 million annually, and a good chunk of that money, read $549 million, was made digitally via online shops. Furthermore, Russia's video game market is the 6th biggest market in Europe and is the 15th biggest in the world. There was and is an audience there. And with that, video game companies abandoning Russia isn't insignificant. After all, companies like Microsoft are publicly traded corporations that prize the idea of exponential growth, i.e. they have to make more money every successive year in order to be seen as successful. But voluntarily leaving a large $3.4 billion market will definitely impact the bottom lines of these companies. It will affect the profit margins. So with that, I have to wonder, what is the business sense here? As stated before, both in this video and past videos, companies ultimately only care about making money, and taking moral stands on social issues, even correct ones, is generally in service to the ulterior goal of benefiting the business. Much like a scummy Square Enix mobile game, these moves don't come free. So with that, why does leaving Russia make sense for these companies business-wise? And to answer, there are a multitude of factors as why a company would want to leave. The most obvious reason being that these companies don't want bad press. They don't want to be a company that is seen as supporting Russia, even if they have physical retail stores or restaurant chains in the country. Because after all, Western markets overwhelmingly support Ukraine. Even in America, a country that is arguably at its most divided since the Civil War, liberals and conservatives are united in their support of Ukraine at the moment. And companies don't want to alienate all their customers at home and across the world to support a country that shattered the illusion of peace in Europe. It is a no-brainer, unless you're Aaron Lewis. Then it's a racist hack. This reasoning has been amplified by the recent advent of corporate conscientiousness. For the past few years, American corporations and other Western companies have taken quote-unquote moral stands on social issues. Whether we are discussing Nike featuring Colin Kaepernick in a commercial, or Gillette's ad criticizing toxic masculinity, companies have started wading into political discussion. From across America, we've seen companies respond to discriminatory laws or practices like Georgia's desire to suppress the vote, or the Texas government's directive to investigate the families of trans kids for child abuse, because of course Greg Abbott is a fucker. And with that, companies are no longer in politics just for tax breaks or deregulation. They are wading into social issues now to the point that when they're absent from a hot-button political issue that immediately affects them, their absence is really noticeable example, see Disney's awful response to Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. And while yes, many of these companies are still very flawed and have their own unsavory business practices, as well as having ulterior profit motives for making moral stands, like with the Nike and Gillette ads, companies do like to at least maintain the appearance of caring. They like to give the illusion of being on the right side of history. It is good branding, after all. This essentially paved the way for corporate America's mass exit in Russia. According to Gary Huffbauer of the Peterson Institute of International Economics, to quote, "We have had this period of emphasis on corporate social responsibility, and many CEOs and directors nominally saying they are all for it. With the woke language, gotta hate that, of the moment, they would be hard-pressed by the background and their statements and the atmosphere not to be out in front of it." End quote. This is very important to note in terms of video game companies severing their ties with Russia. See, most video game companies didn't have a lot to lose by closing up shop in Russia for the time being. For the most part, they are only stopping Russians from being able to purchase their products, which is mostly done online. And for those companies with physical products in stores, all they have to do is stop sending in new shipments of products. It's pretty simple. And with that, many of these gaming companies don't have Russian employees to pay or retail space that they need to manage. They can just cut ties for the time being and forbid sales online or in person and be okay with taking a profit loss as long as they are seen as being on the right side of this issue, because no one wants bad press these days. See Disney. Admittedly, there is another reason as to why Western companies are leaving Russia, one that has to do with operational headaches for businesses. See, many businesses that either had physical retail stores or specialized in popular products that weren't sold online were hesitant to shut down their business operations in Russia. In fact, McDonald's was one such example. After all, it has roughly 850 locations in the country and has a lot to lose by leaving. But they ultimately suspended operations because 1, they wanted to make a moral stand, and 2, there's a lot of logistical issues. They have to worry about physical locations, employees, currency exchange, inflation, the ruble crash, labor, and how to avoid violating sanctions. Hell, there's even the fact that a lot of Russian locations are franchises that are run by Russian owners rather than McDonald's itself. Note, this is also why so many Russian Papa John's remain open as well. It's a lot for a company to deal with, so it makes a lot of sense to just pull out rather than wade into that clusterfuck any more than you have to. But still, I believe that these companies are mostly pulling out of Russia due to being against the war first and foremostly, though whether that's due to altruistic or monetary reasons is up to debate. After all, these businesses are leaving due to Russia starting a war in Ukraine, and with that, all other reasons are secondary. Sure, the business logistics aren't optimal inside Russia at all right now, but if it really was all about how tough day-to-day business operations are now that the ruble crashed, as well as the rampant inflation and sanctions, then all the video game companies that are preventing online sales wouldn't have quit Russia's economy in droves. Online sales platforms closing down is comparatively much lower risk compared to running a retail location with hundreds of stores, meaning that regardless of certain companies' worries about logistical issues, these were all secondary motives compared to the first motive about making a political statement. And yes, whether intentionally or not, leaving Russia due to its war in Ukraine is a political and immoral stance. By leaving, or in some cases in staying in Russia, companies are letting their customers know what their values are. Whether intentional or not, companies are taking a moral stand, albeit one that is ultimately still self-serving, of course, because capitalism is bad, obviously. So what happens next? In terms of Russia and Ukraine, that war is being fought as we speak, so it's too early to tell what will happen other than the fact that it raises more questions. Is Russia's war with Ukraine and the subsequent corporate exodus a sign of deglobalization? Is the world going to be more insular? And what happens if China tries to start a war with Taiwan, a situation that has many parallels with Russia and Ukraine? Will these companies also pull out even though China's economy is so much more valuable than Russia? It's a lot of questions, and honestly there aren't very many answers here. We will have to wait and see, though note that many companies are having discussions about how they want to handle the next potential geopolitical shakeup, because with Russia there is now a standard response, albeit a severe one, to that potential scenario. God, this world. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of this whole shit show. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto my Discord server, and $5 a month allows you to start making review requests. The link to the Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, especially my high tier ones in David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.